Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm Chris Humphrey, the Executive Director at the EU-ASEAN Business Council. Thank you so much for joining us here early on a Monday morning for our latest webinar, Catch Me If You Can, Unpacking Financial Crime in ASEAN. This morning's webinar is talking about trade-based money laundering, the connections then to global financial integrity across the region and indeed across Asia as a whole, the links between illicit trade and trade-based money laundering. We have a very distinguished panel with us today to talk about this, very experienced practitioners in this area. We have with us, and it is Sunday evening, so a special thank you to John Cassara joining us. He is the author of Trade-Based Money Laundering, The Next Frontier in International Money Laundering Enforcement, and Money Laundering and Illicit Financial Flows, following the money and value trails. John has a very long and distinguished career working in government as a covert intelligence officer, working in places like the US Treasury, US Secret Service, and US Customs Service, and has tons of experience in looking at illicit trade and money laundering activities. We're also very pleased to have with us Adam Parks. He's the Regional Attaché to Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands for Homeland Security Investigations, based out of Canberra in Australia. So good morning to you, Adam. Adam has served in a variety of law enforcement roles, including in Homeland Security, and is a National Program Manager at the Joint Terrorism Task Force. We also have with us here in Singapore, Lena Berstiger. She's the Head of Illicit Trade Prevention, External Engagement for Asia for Philip Morris. She's part of Philip Morris's global anti-illicit trade team and oversees various initiatives to address the growing illicit trade threat in the Asia-Pacific region, a role which enables her cooperating with governments, law enforcement, brand owners, and a range of international organizations. And then your moderator today, I'm very pleased to have Richard Carrick. He's the CEO of Crime Stoppers Asia, which is an NGO focused on the detection and prevention of transnational organized crime, including human and wildlife trafficking. And CSA works a lot with law enforcement agencies using advanced data analytic technologies and helps to trace down the money flows that come from illicit trade. Richard has a long experience in this area. He previously worked at Barclays Bank, where he's responsible for financial crime assurance and intelligence units, and has worked also right across the world in a number of compliance roles in the banking community, including throughout Europe and in Asia as well. So with that, I will hand the reins to Richard as the moderator. I wish you all to have a very good session. For the attendees online, if you have questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens, and we'll try and get through to them as many as we can. So Richard, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Welcome everybody. I think trade-based money laundering, I think, is definitely something that has been, I think, a problem within the industry for the longest time. I think even groups like the Wolfsburg Group have noted that it's very, very difficult to be able to tackle something like this, just given the fact that it's all cross-border. There's so many different groups involved in a trade transaction, and it's very difficult to coordinate a response across all of these different aspects of a transaction. What I'll do is actually approach the topic. I guess we'll maybe start off by looking at some of the issues are around trade-based money laundering and why it is so difficult to crack, and then we can go into what are some of the solutions that can be done in the future. I think what I'd like to do first is kind of throw out to our floor that's around trade-based money laundering topologies. Just wanted to find out what some of you folks are finding out there is some of the more prevalent trade-based money laundering topologies that are sort of fairly common throughout Asia. Why don't we start with Adam, work our way around, and all panelists please chime in as we go around.
Thank you, Richard, and good morning to everybody that's attending. Once again, I'm Adam Parks. I'm based in Australia. I'm the regional head for Homeland Security Investigations, and we're the investigative arm of DHS. So we handle illicit trade travel and finance investigations for the United States. But to Richard, to your question, what we see most often are the various forms of TBML, especially here in the region, are under invoicing, over invoicing, multiple invoicing, falsely describing goods, obfuscation, and phantom shipping. And where that comes into play, the four large categories that we see in our investigations as far as commodities: electronics, namely mobile phones. They're obviously small with high value. We see vehicles and parts, heavy weight. Oftentimes they can be put into a large container, and it's difficult for customs inspectors to inspect. We see textiles and apparel. Obviously, there's a lot of different ways that the value of those items can be manifested. And then we see precious stones and metals. Those are typically the top four categories in our investigations.
That's great. Thanks, Adam. Actually, moving around to Lena, do you notice, I guess, what are you noticing, I guess, within your industry as far as some of the topologies that are used? And is there sort of links to a trend towards links of organized crime in that as well?
Thank you very much, Richard. So good morning, good evening, everyone. It's really an honor to be here with such great speakers on this, let's say, virtual stage today. So thank you all for dialing in. So when it comes to the tobacco industry, I think just like you mentioned earlier, Richard, and you as well, Adam, it's very difficult to be able to grasp the magnitude of the issue. But if we just look at some numbers from the World Health Organization and from the World Bank, when it comes to illicit trade in tobacco products, we're talking about 600 billion sticks of cigarettes a year, which are consumed are illegal. So that would represent around 10 to 12% of global consumption. So this is huge. And when it comes to loss of revenue as well for governments, we're talking about numbers between 40 and 50 billion US dollars a year. And 20% of that takes place here in Asia. In this panel today, where we're looking at the ASEAN region, so if you just look at the 10 ASEAN countries, there we're talking about 75 billion sticks of cigarettes, so which is huge. Again, a loss of close to 3 billion US dollars in tax revenue loss for governments. So it goes without saying that this is huge amount of money that could be injected back in economies, in infrastructure, and other things. Especially today, I think it's really important in time of pandemic with COVID-19, with governments, which are going to be seeing loss of revenue. So I think it's a really big issue in Asia. When we talk about illicit trade of tobacco, maybe we would put them in four specific kind of buckets. So the first one would be contraband cigarettes. So these are cigarettes which are moved from one country to another. So you have, big tax and price discrepancies between two countries. So it's very lucrative business. Just if you look at Indonesia, a pack of cigarettes is 5 times cheaper than here in Singapore. So just being able to buy that in bulk over there, move it across border and sell it into Singapore on the black market, it's huge revenue for illicit traders. The second category we have, of course, are counterfeit. This is probably the one which is also most well known by the wide public. This had been going down in the last 10 years, but suddenly we're seeing this growing again. So again, criminals are seeing an opportunity here to counterfeit products, move them around at very low prices, and make a huge incentive. The last one would be what we call under declaration. So that happens in one country where actually the products are just simply produced legally by a manufacturer in one country, and they only declare a certain amount to the government, hence again not paying the tax. So I think that it's a very lucrative business for criminals, and we've seen links with, yes, organized crime. There's also links with terrorism. I think the United States is specifically a country that has flagged that, saying that there are huge links between illicit tobacco and terrorism and Hezbollah and so on. Maybe I'd add as well, just to show again in terms of the magnitude in the country just close by here, which is Malaysia, we're talking about 60% of tobacco consumed is illegal. So there you also see another issue with his public acceptance of the illicit products. In some cases, it can just be that they have no idea that they're buying something illegal. They have no idea they're funding criminal organizations. Or in some case, they actually know it, but they don't really care because the prices there was a huge tax spike in 2018 in Malaysia of 38%, which actually made the illicit go really, really high. So that's kind of what we see here in the Asia region. So illicit trade in tobacco product is it's obviously an issue for us as a company. For legitimate business, it's an issue for governments for loss of revenue. It facilitates fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, and like I said, funds organized crime.
Well, it seems to cover a lot. Yeah, I guess the amount of revenue that's probably missing from some of these countries. I've spoken to kind of authorities in places like the UK. It's absolutely in the billions. I'd imagine at a point in time when all the public funds are going into battling COVID, the last thing they need to do is actually lose even more revenue. Actually, over to you, John. Actually, I believe you have written a book with a whole lot of typologies in it around trade-based money laundering. If there's any, maybe one or two that you think are just like the ones that you find most fascinating, it'd be interesting to hear about that.
Actually, I have written a couple of books, Chris. Thank you, and thank you for having me here today with you. I'm saying good morning to everybody, but it's night here in the States, so it's a little different for me. There's an American expression, 800-pound gorilla. It's kind of an American English expression for an entity very, very powerful, and something that can throw its weight around and act without regards to others. And when you're talking about typologies and you're talking about what's going on in ASEAN, I think of that expression because when it comes to illicit trade and ASEAN, China is that 800-pound gorilla. And for that matter, it's also that 800-pound gorilla for most of the rest of the world. There's lots of different TBML typologies used by China and Chinese actors, but I'd like to mention two that you normally don't think about, probably. And the first one is capital flight. Global Financial Integrity, and I'm on the board of directors of Global Financial Integrity, estimates that the Chinese economy hemorrhaged over $1 trillion in illicit financial outflows from the year 2000 to 2011. That's bad, but the trends are accelerating today. And much of this is in the form of trade misinvoicing. Today, China is the largest exporter of illicit capital in the world. In fact, I'm quoting a former Chinese ambassador, a former Canadian ambassador to China in my book, says China is the #1 exporter of hot money to the world. Now, there's lots of different ways that Chinese circumvent capital controls. We can talk about some of those later on if you would like. But trade-based money laundering and trade-based value transfer, particularly the under-invoicing of trade goods, is very, very common. And I think a lot of your members might see that. Another TBML typology that's also related to China, Chinese actors, underground financial systems. We hear an awful lot about Hawala, the underground financial system that, from the Middle East, from South Asia, that basically is circled the world. But I think actually this system is dwarfed by the Chinese flying money systems. And I use that in plural because there are many systems. This system goes back, to this Tang dynasty, about 700 or 800. But the important thing to recognize about this system is that historically and culturally, trade is used to counter the book or to provide countervaluation between brokers. In other words, a means to balance the books between traders. They use trade goods. That has not changed for literally, almost 1,500 years. So it's still in existence. We still see it. It's very, very underground. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of reporting on this from law enforcement or from Intel. Business doesn't see it, but it's there. I think it's very, very important for ASEAN to be aware of these kinds of things.
Yeah, I think well, the Hawala is an interesting one, and it becomes even more interesting with sort of the COVID pandemic. Hawala usually involves you needing to physically take cash into somebody, and somebody going in to visit somebody else in another country to physically pick up the cash that he's going to hand over, and then they have their sort of offline ledger. I imagine this is going to be probably a benefit. Or kind of an opportunity for law enforcement, because a lot of these Hawala operations are now being kind of forced online with quarantines and the like. So that's, I think, definitely something to look into. Maybe also to just chime in from the banking perspective as to why do we use these trade-based money laundering techniques? Why is it probably the best thing, other than well, it probably is the single best way to launder money, because you can move very large amounts of money, and just by falsifying invoices, for instance. And when you're actually going through the banks, I guess the types of those types of payments aren't under as much scrutiny, or they're a lot more difficult for a bank to actually detect, simply because when you're doing your red flag checks at the bank and going through the list, you realize that you only see one small piece of the puzzle, and each one of the kind of aspects of a transaction can look totally innocent until you see it in the context of a wider cross-border transnational context, which you don't, because of client privacy rules, you don't get a chance to see that. So that's definitely, I think, one of the things that makes it quite challenging. I'd like to go back to you, Adam, and find out, just from a law enforcement point of view, what do you see as being sort of the big challenge in trying to detect criminal activities related to trade-based money laundering?
Yeah, so thank you, Richard. So I would say the biggest challenge is new sets of information. So after 9/11, the United States passed the Patriot Act, which enhanced the due diligence requirements on many U.S. financial institutions. And what we've seen over the past several years is a decrease in bulk cash smuggling, both activity, but also reported bulk layering attempts into the banks. And what we have also seen is an increase in trade-based money laundering. So as banks have been more difficult for people to invest their illicit cash into, they've moved into these trade-based money laundering schemes. And one of the interesting aspects of this is, what I always like to say is, if you want to launder millions of dollars, you have many different options. If you want to launder hundreds of millions of dollars, you have maybe one option, and that's trade-based money laundering. And because of that, you have the involvement of many third-party facilitators. So these could be lawyers, these could be customs brokers, they could be corrupt government officials that help you get your money out, or help you document trade in such a way that it provides that concealment for your smuggling attempt. So these are all emerging trends, and these are all things where, as international trade has grown, obviously with the e-commerce and the movement to offshore a lot of businesses, that's created an extensive level of complexity towards international trade that these criminal organizations are able to use. Meanwhile, customs organizations have not grown, and their ability to detect and inspect cargo has also not grown. So it's created quite the challenge in that complexity. We've been able to rely on new data sets, and so data has been one big point of progress. Another point of progress has been our relations, government to government. HSI and the United States government has created what we call trade transparency units. And these are units that engage in trade data sharing. So we overlay the trade data. For example, we have one in Australia, we have one in New Zealand, and we have one in Philippines in the Asia Pacific region. And what we do is we share US trade data and overlay it onto their trade data, so we can identify discrepancies. We can identify common prices, so that when there are fluctuations in price, we can identify those shipments, maybe for further inspection. So those limited resources that we have in the customs environment can be applied in a much more strategic manner. but also private partnership, with the financial sectors, with brand holders. It's extremely important that they hold a lot of information, a lot of intelligence, but also the subject matter expertise that we don't have in law enforcement to identify what's not standard in their industry. So if there's something that's out of flux, if you will, we may not have that information from a US or really any law enforcement perspective, but working with someone, for example, like Lena, who's able to identify, hey, this is out of character, this is an organization, or this is a shipment methodology that is not standard in our industry, that allows us to then potentially direct our resources towards more advantageous routes that will produce interdictions and seizures and detections.
All right. Okay. So it's actually, Lena. So in a perfect world, then, what information would you need, from a public-private partnership, for instance, to help you get a bigger picture that would actually help you, tackle some of the issues that you face in your industry?
I think definitely I couldn't agree more with Adam. The fact that it's important, collaboration is extremely important, may it be between governments or with also IGOs, NGOs, with the private sector. Everyone holds a certain amount of information, and be able to put all of that together and analyze data. That's the only way we can tackle such a huge monster like this. So for us, definitely working with law enforcement is important, and Homeland Security is actually a great organization, I guess, to do that with it. For us, one of the things also we look at and we see as a huge issue are free trade zones. So in no way am I saying that free trade zones are bad. Free trade zones are a legitimate tool, to facilitate trade, to allow governments to bring foreign direct investment and so on. So that's a good thing. It's a good thing for us as a business to be able to move around our goods, right? We operate in we sell in over 180 countries around the world. So absolutely need to be there. But on the other hand, there are also loopholes to be able to facilitate trade, have cargo move fast. There's also a bit of lack of oversight in these free trade zones. And that's absolutely something that criminals take advantage of. They see these loopholes and they use free trade zones to move the goods. I can give you a concrete example. For example, some of the manufacturing of tobacco product also takes place in free trade zones. So they produce it legally, what we call the illicit whites, in a free trade zone. It is exported and declared as cigarettes. All of that is done really well. Then it goes into another free trade zone, or maybe another one and another one. It can be several. It ends up in a bonded warehouse, and there maybe it will enter as a container, and then afterward it will be unpacked, put into smaller packages, go onto trucks, and then be misdeclared going into another country as another product. So those issues are really hard to tackle. So, and this is not only us saying this. I think many other organizations have flagged free trade zones as one of the issues. The OECD actually recently published a guidance on transparency for free trade zones and a code of conduct to see what type of things can be put in place to ameliorate this, give better governance in the free trade zones. The World Free Zone Organization as well has a program which they call the Safe Zone Program. And the WHO itself, also under the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, there's a global treaty which is called the Protocol to Eliminate Illicit Trade of Tobacco Products, have also decided to look into what are the issues relating to free trade zones. This is something we really support, because you have 61 countries around the world which are part of this treaty looking at this as a problem. So for us, that would be one thing, would be regulation, policy changes within free trade zones, and also supporting customs, because in some cases it's not either a criticism on customs. The law in place just doesn't allow them to seize the products. Maybe they can inform the next port of call or something like that. Or they also have no idea if the container is full of shoes that should cost a certain amount, or another product that they don't know. So I think there again, collaboration, being able to give the opportunity of capacity building for customs to tell them what is right and what is not supposed to be right, like Adam mentioned earlier.
So, but I guess in a perfect world, if you could go to Adam and say, I want that data because that's going to help me find stuff. What data would you want Adam to give you? And
well, of course, of course, Yeah, I mean, just like Adam mentioned, I mean, I think the trade transparency units is something fantastic. If they could be in an ideal world, the possibility for the private sector to also put into that trade data and compare what we have, what maybe the government in the Philippines has, and US trade data as well. If everyone starts putting that in one place, we can start really flagging who's behind all of this, because you always have often we'll do the seizures happening in certain countries that we're taking down. There's a container being seized, that's fantastic. A few people get arrested, but we're never tracing it really back to the source of the problem. Who's the head of the snake to go after that? So if we could, with an organization like Homeland Security, be able to share that kind of data, that would be an ideal world.
So Richard, one point on that from the U.S. history is, again, I mentioned the Patriot Act earlier, but a law that we call 314B allows financial institutions in the United States after 9/11 to actually share information amongst each other. So many times when a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme is uncovered, it doesn't just hit one financial institution, it's hitting several financial institutions. And that's not just financial related alone. It could be a brand holder, it could be many different people that have stake in the game, to be able to share that information and then bring that case to law enforcement. Obviously, law enforcement has an important job to do still, to refine that data, to confirm the data, and to build it up through things like undercover operations, etc. However, there's a very valuable role amongst the private sector, being able to communicate and identify points where the same criminal networks are hitting various different institutions along the way that are not government, that can bring that information to law enforcement and allow us to do our jobs even better and sort of accelerate the process.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, that's definitely, I guess, as far as, I guess, well, maybe we would start talking about the solutions, but it's definitely important to ensure that the data across, I guess, multiple groups can sort of be put together as I guess, one means of actually tackling the problem. Actually, maybe go over to you, John. As far as, I guess, we've just discussed, I guess, a lot of the difficulties in being able to detect financial crime, or trade-based financial crime. But what do you sort of see as a solution going forward? What are some of the things that we could potentially do to be in a position to at least detect it, given it's so difficult? Oh, you're on mute. Still on mute. Hit the button. No. There you go. Yeah, back.
Okay. I'm sorry. I've been losing audio and video. I've been losing connectivity. I've been going in and out, so it's been very, very difficult for me to listen in and to understand what's been said. So your question is regarding solutions, possible solutions?
Yeah.
Okay. I think the first solution, if you look at it, is government. And I think Adam has talked a little bit about trade transparency units. I think this is a concept that needs to be expanded. It was invented about 2003, 2004. It shows a lot of promise, but that's just the first step. We also have to do a lot with industry. And talking about, for example, industry consortiums, trade associations getting together, sharing data. A lot of the same actors are involved. Criminal organizations are involved. It doesn't make any difference if it's illicit tobacco or narcotics or whatever it is. It's the same types of methodologies, the same types of schemes. A lot of these industry groups, trade associations collect this type of data, collect intelligence. And unfortunately, sometimes it's stovepiped. It would be much more beneficial, I think, to share this throughout various industry groups that are affected by this type of thing, and then to share it with government, to share it with law enforcement, to share their intelligence, and then hopefully then law enforcement, customs, whatever, can start working some of these cases and then give these industry groups and associations the feedback they so desperately need. There are also some technical solutions, and maybe we could talk about that going forward.
Oh, great. Yep. Definitely, because I know the public-private partnership approach is something that we actually see in the financial industry. So if we take a look at, say, the UK, I believe the first one was the Joint Money Laundering Intelligence Task Force, and the way that works is you have the banks getting together with the regulator, and also then the National Crime Financial Intelligence Unit, which is law enforcement, the National Crime Agency that handles that. I think the way a lot of those operate, and when that in the UK is just one example, there's the Fintel Alliance in Australia, there's ASIP in Singapore, and there's a FIMLIT over in Hong Kong, and several more of these kind of coming up. But I think the main thing that a lot of these groups do is they tend to just discuss topologies. I guess there's a lot of legal constraints. The UK has an act that allows the financial institution, say, to provide information on a particular topic to the National Crime Agency, who acts as that sort of clearance center, that umbrella that takes it from all of the banks, so that you can start putting together that sort of transnational picture. But of course, the UK is only one country, and each of these groups are only one country. The difficulty then becomes, well, cross-border. How does that then play out? I'm just wondering if there's a role for some of the international agencies. We've got, you've got groups like Interpol, Europol. We've also got UNODC, and there's also several other agencies out there. Would it be kind of a solution going forward if industry, law enforcement, financial services, transportation companies could get into a global umbrella? I'd just like to get some thoughts on that, maybe starting with Adam.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea. Now, obviously, there are a few already kind of global organizations out there. One of the ones that tends to work really well in this space is the World Customs Organization, as a sort of a customs agency, HSI, because we were split from United States Customs after 9/11. We have the ability to share information with other countries' customs authorities on a very kind of real-time basis through what's called a Customs Mutual Assistance Agreement. So for those who aren't located in US jurisdictions or who are already working with their US law enforcement agencies, I would recommend your customs agency in your own country as a great place to start, with potentially engaging in that private-public cooperation and outreach. But yeah, there's definitely a place for this. And again, I think I brought up earlier, but after 9/11, US law enforcement and US financial sector was very nervous about sharing with each other. And we understand now that trust is a process, that, there's things that the private sector need out of that sharing, but also to protect, and there's things that the public sector needs as well. And over almost the past 20 years, we've done a pretty good job of protecting each other's interests and making sure that we both get what we need from that. And so whenever those opportunities arise, if there is a US law enforcement agency in whatever countries of the participants, working in a foreign capacity, definitely reach out, because that is one of the things that we're typically engaged, Richard, like you said, in the Fintel Alliance here in Australia, or, working with like groups such as ACAMS and others worldwide to outreach and engage. And we're always happy to sort of lead from the front and show how that sharing can be done. But I definitely do think that there's a place for additional coordination in the space.
Definitely. So why don't we just put together a kind of a hypothetical public-private partnership that's global, and then we can figure out, well, what does each group sort of kind of contribute to this kind of hypothetical partnership? So let's say you've got groups like, say, Interpol. You've got some of the larger banking regulators, some of the large banks. We got large industry that kind of faces a large problem with trade-based money laundering. Maybe, Lena, in that kind of a scenario, what is it that you would like to be able to kind of add into that kind of a partnership?
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that question, Richard. And maybe I'd like to build a bit on what both John and Adam said, which is really great, and what we look at as well. I think when John mentioned that it's often the same MOs, right? It's often the same groups of criminals and so on. So, for example, one of the things that us at the company, obviously, we take illicit trade of tobacco products as we take it seriously. We have over 100 people dedicated to this globally. So we do research, we do awareness, we work with law enforcement, we work with NGOs, IGOs, and so on. And one of the things we did, because we thought we can't just tackle the one issue of illicit trade of tobacco products, we have to tackle it widely. And one of the things we did is that we committed $100 million actually to this fund that we call PMI Impact. And with PMI Impact, this is actually any organization, private, public, small company, big company, anyone can actually apply for a grant over there, submit a project, and that is going to tackle illegal trade and related crimes. It doesn't have to be tobacco. So for example, we funded projects in the region looking at wildlife trafficking, looking at human trafficking, looking at illegal fishing. We also funded academia to do research on it. So I think one thing that, if in that scenario that you put together, Richard, that we could do as Philip Morris is bring the research, bring the information we have, may it be from these other projects we have, may it be the work we do also in, like you mentioned again, child trade associations. We work closely with the EU-ASEAN Business Council within a group with other people from other industries. We have automobile, pharmaceutical, alcohol, and we have a lot of information there, and we work to bring awareness around these issues to the ASEAN government. So we could bring all of that information and definitely participate. We're ready to participate with everyone, anyone even on the call today wants to give me a call, send me an email. I'm always happy to talk about illicit trade. So that's what I think we could bring, that all the information we have. We gather intelligence on everything, container movement, on organizations which are behind this, on consignees, shippers. We work a lot, for example, also with the shipping companies as well.
Okay, great, awesome. So John, what else can we throw into this group to kind of detect trade-based money laundering? So we got our international partnership here. What else can we kind of throw in to maybe have a better chance of detecting this complex transnational crime? You're on mute again.
Thank you. I think there are a few things we can do. And again, we mentioned technology, and I'm going to lump data into that. And Adam kind of talked about that at the very beginning, but we've just had an exponential growth in trade data over the last even 5 years. There are so many data sources right now for both trade and shipping data. And a lot of these data sources are publicly available. Yes, you have to pay a fee to get access to it, but it's unbelievable now what's in the public domain. And I think the other thing that we could do that wouldn't certainly solve all TBML issues, but I think it's something that we need to explore further, and that is, smart containers and increased container security in general. And Richard, I think you mentioned this also at the beginning, how many steps along the way that a single shipping transaction involves. I think there are way over 20, including ports and freight forwarders and carriers and customs agencies. But widespread use of smart containers, it's going to help with some of that because it offers real-time monitoring of a container's locations, its internal conditions, its physical integrity. You can track it anywhere around the world. So the features basically will allow people to authorize the opening of each container. And even the data involved could be then forwarded to customs services and be an additional tool for them to help monitor, you know, where a container has been, who's opened it, would it qualify for expedited clearance and this type of thing. So I think we're getting into the stage of there are some technical things that can be done. And just one more thing I'm going to throw out, because I'd love some others' opinions on this. But my opinion is, if we really want to be serious about cracking down on TBML, if we really want to get people to focus on this, we need to get the FATF involved. Because in the world of AML, CFT, the FATF makes things happen. And I would love to see FATF finally do something about this and pass a separate recommendation, call it recommendation 41, that covers trade-based money laundering.
Mhm. That would be good. Yeah, I think you touch on some really good points, particularly around data and technology and being able to do something with that. I think as far as detecting it, what's probably needed is almost a shared intelligence platform, or some means that all of this data can be collected. So whether it's information from smart containers, whether it's bills of lading, whether it's ship AIS tracking movements, whether it's some of the industry knowledge that you get, you know, from organizations such as Lena's that kind of can alert you to various topologies and ways things are happening. I imagine the futuristic ideal endpoint is when you have a group such as international law enforcement, financial institutions, the transportation sector, and a lot of the other industry sectors, all sitting together on one platform and able to actually share the information that they have. And then being, I guess, to use data analytics to piece together the various cases to figure out, well, what is happening at each step of the way across these 20 processes you referred to, John, is probably a way forward. It's definitely something that we as Crime Stoppers, sort of being traditionally a consolidator of tips, information to pass to law enforcement, is I guess the next step in the evolution is going to be around bringing a lot of these groups around a shared platform. Whereby we can actually provide anonymous data. We can actually add that to particular cases, enrich it all with things like smart container input down the road, and then be able to come up with fairly detailed cases that can be passed to the relevant law enforcement agency that's in a position to deal with that. Hopefully that's sort of a vision does start to take shape. It's definitely, I think, something that's needed in the industry, and I think something that's totally been missed across the years, which probably has allowed trade-based money laundering to be over the trillion mark and completely undetected. I think right now it seems that the majority of the controls are around you know, random customs checks, but if given possible manpower, it's like less than, I think, 1% of these containers can be checked. So definitely being able to target high-risk containers would be definitely quite good. Awesome. I think it's probably time to answer a few questions. So maybe I'll hand back to you, Chris, and we can maybe take it from there.
Thanks, Richard. It's a fascinating discussion so far. There's actually one question on the chat, which I'd like to throw at all of you. It's how has the advent of cryptocurrencies impacted on the ability of law enforcement or financial institutions to help track on money-based, trade-based money laundering? Is it making your life easier, more difficult?
This is Adam. From a TBML standpoint, we haven't seen a big impact on cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency, in our experience, continues to be used by small money laundering attempts, small criminal conspiracies. Still, the large bulk kind of value transfers that are needed by large transnational criminal organizations are still being done, both in cash, TBML, precious metals, etc.
Yeah, I would just like to add that I think cryptocurrencies, it's a really sexy topic, and people like to talk about it. And I think it's important that we continue to explore it. We've done it. Once again, we've had a lot of progress even over the last 2-3 years, where before a lot of this stuff, they were saying that, oh, law enforcement can never follow the crypto trail. We have made incredible progress. But the point I'm trying to make is, if you look at money laundering in general and all the different methodologies out there, we are still getting killed the old-fashioned way. By far, the bulk of money laundering goes through financial institutions, it goes through bulk cash smuggling, it goes through trade-based money laundering, et cetera, et cetera. Crypto is probably just a small fraction of that. Now, that may change 5-10 years from now, but right now, I think we need to devote more resources to traditional money laundering, because until we demonstrate that we can stop traditional money laundering, and when I say traditional money laundering, through the old-fashioned methodologies that I just named, they're going to continue to use it.
Okay, thanks. And I think that related to that, perhaps then, there's a question about using technology to help you more. So using blockchain technology, perhaps, to try and trace things. So using secure data connections between the private sector, between law enforcement, between financial institutions. So are you seeing a lot more of blockchain type activity to help you in your work in tracing things through? Now, are there any sort of regulatory issues that you are facing in terms of being able to share data between the private sector and the public sector?
So I'll jump in there again from the U.S. side. So I'm aware that it's been publicly reported that U.S. Customs and Border Protection is currently using a test pilot system to engage blockchain technology against trade data. That's still yet to mature, but that is something that's being explored. We haven't seen a lot of impact yet on our work on that. But as far as technology is concerned, there's lots of different ways. And I think John spoke about earlier, there's a lot of data in the space. When it comes to being able to share that data, individual trade data is proprietary, so it's hard to share outside of government. But in the aggregate, and also through what John mentioned with some of the private sector companies that have access to that data, that is available to non-government institutions.
Yeah, I'd like to throw in actually blockchain from the financial sector. If you take a look at sort of trade finance, letters of credit, a lot of that information is actually being, particularly the documentary information, is actually being captured in blockchain, which actually makes life a little bit easier because it'll actually prevent kind of reuse of invoices so that some of the criminal gangs will sort of reuse the same invoice over and over again. You can have one true copy sitting on the blockchain that everybody can see. I know a couple of larger banks have actually done experiments of putting letters of credit in the documentation on blockchain. It's also been very beneficial for the industry because it speeds things up, but it actually does make things a lot more transparent.
Well, then maybe Chris, on our side, I do know that we are looking at it as well and exploring what kind of solutions we could have blockchain, but still immature as well at this point. But what we do, for example, for our own products, we have very strict anti-diversion measures in place to avoid, as much as we can, what I explained earlier on, the tobacco being bought in one country at a very low price to be sold in another one at a much higher price because of the price differentiation. We have tracking and tracing systems on each of our products. So that goes down to the individual pack. Each one has a unique identification number. Each one has a dotted code that we can scan, and it's aggregated afterwards to the carton, to the master case, and then we can really, when a seizure takes place, for example, at customs, they will invite us over, we'll collect those codes, and then we'll track it back to try and find out where is that point of diversion and how can we address the issue there. Sometimes it works better than others. Often what happens is that it's bought in several places and put together in one container, so it's more difficult, but that's something at least we do at a company level to make sure that we secure our supply chain.
The question had a lot to do with trade finance, and I think it's important to underline the fact that about 80% of trade, global trade, is open account trading by financial institutions. So there's really no trade finance involved. And the only reason I put this out there is that financial institutions most definitely have a role to play in combating trade-based money laundering. I don't want to say that they don't, but again, about 80% of trade, there's going to be very, very little that they can actually look at. I saw some numbers. I just wanted to throw these out because I just came across them. The U.S. government, GAO, General Accounting Office, just did a study on trade-based money laundering, and they looked at SARS filed for a 4-year period. SARS filed suspicious activity reports filed with Treasury's Financial Intelligence Unit. There were only 7,000 SARS filed during that time period that had to do with trade-based money laundering. But at the same time, over 10 million SARS were filed, okay? 7,000 out of 10 million. So that gives you a little bit of an idea, just a window of the kind of opportunity, if you will, that financial institutions might have to look at trade-based money laundering, primarily perhaps through trade finance.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big problems I've noticed within the financial industry is trade finance tends to be, trade finance operations tends to be very manual because one trade transaction could have like over 100 pages of documentation in it, and because these come in various formats, it's really doesn't have a great deal of digitization in most banks' trade finance operations. It involves somebody who's very experienced kind of reading through these things with a tick list and looking for something suspicious, and at the end he sort of just staples the tick list onto the top of the pile of transactions and off it goes. But I think definitely until we can get into some kind of digitization strategies that are adopted, maybe blockchain could be one of the ways to do it, but that's probably going to be required before banks would probably have an ability to detect suspicious things across more accurately and across a wider number of data sets. So I think that's something that needs to be taken into consideration in any sort of kind of global solution.
Thanks, Richard. We're coming up towards the top of the hour, so perhaps I'll just ask you all one final question, give you a chance to create your wish list of things. So but perhaps we'll go with Lena first. If you had a wish list, what 2 or 3 things would you like the law enforcement and the public sector to do to help you in your role in preventing illicit trading in your own products?
Well, it's a very long one, but 2 or 3. Well, first of all, more of this. Honestly, already here, being able to speak to all 3, to Adam, John, Richard, who have, specialists in their area, and it's a lot to learn for me, for myself, for our organization as well. So being able to have more of these discussions, webinars, roundtables, one-on-ones, I think that's really top of the list, and be able to see how we can collaborate more. I'm very intrigued, and I look forward to seeing what Richard will do for Crime Stoppers Asia, and putting together something where we can share data, share intelligence. And I'm definitely interested in, if there's a part for me to play there, definitely interested to support and to follow what you'd be doing there. So again, the wish list, I think top priorities is always collaboration, collaboration, collaboration. And hopefully being able to have more of such discussions with other organizations like that were mentioned earlier, like Interpol, which has its base here in Singapore. It has its cybersecurity base here, so being able to work with organizations like that as well would be fantastic. And yes.
Thank you. And Adam, from a law enforcement point of view, what more are you looking for from brand owners to help you?
Yeah, so very similar to what Lena said. You know, it's been said often, it takes a network to defeat a network. And that the private sector has a very important role to play in that. And you know, wish list would just be tips, leads, information, and you know, allow us to build that trust process. You know, leave it with us. If there's something that you identify in your various you know, market or system that appears odd or out of place, you know, contact HSI, contact me. I think my contact information is available. If it's not within my area, I can refer it to somebody else, but allow us to kind of build that relationship with you. And also, you know, understand that there is a role to play, that our interests do overlap. I know in some countries it's a little bit taboo to work between the private and public sectors, but oftentimes public safety, national security, all those things kind of have that overlapping interest with some of the things that the brand holders and the private sector have. So I just say, just continue to work with us and be comfortable, and give us the opportunity to help you out.
Thanks, Adam. And John, for you, as a former intelligence officer working in this area and now an author, are there some key trends that you've seen develop over the years in terms of public-private collaboration, which have been really, really helpful?
You know, it's been interesting, Chris. I've looked at trade-based money laundering now since the late 1980s, early 1990s, and at that time there was hardly any awareness of what trade-based money laundering was. The term was not commonly known. And a few of us started to a process of education, trying to get governments to pay attention, trying to get industry to pay attention. It really took off a little bit after 9/11 because of threat finance. But I think from that perspective, and going back to your question about, you know, public-private partnership and all this, I think what's really come home to me, looking back over almost 3 decades here, is the fact that trade-based money laundering is now kind of common terminology. People get it. Okay, people are aware of it. Where not too many years ago, you say trade-based money laundering, they had not a clue what you were talking about. So we've made an incredible amount of progress just in that regards, but we now need to take it to the next.
I seem to have lost John again. He's having a few problems. Richard, perhaps I'll just close out with you. Actually, you can tell us more about how you see the future in this topic going, and the role that institutions like Crime Stoppers Asia can play in it.
Yeah, I think in the future it's going to be definitely the collaboration side, just as Adam mentioned, takes a network to defeat a network. I think the best possible thing is to be able to get the data that is required across each step of a trade transaction, also being able to use that data to find out the larger criminal networks. In a perfect world, Crime Stoppers has the capability already today to use data analytics to be able to determine you know, suspicious networks and what they're up to. It's just a question of bringing all the right people to the table who can provide data and information that we can add on top of our tips, so that we can kind of work together in a virtual environment to be able to I guess, flesh out various cases, and then that's kind of a case file we would like everybody to be able to have, so they have that kind of awareness on specific criminal activity, and they can actually go and tackle it. We would definitely need other organizations, trade organizations, similar to some of the ones that Lena is a part of, and also with her industry. Definitely need the law enforcement people, because Adam's groups, the trade transparency units coming in, and also larger coordination bodies like Interpol, for instance. But ultimately, it's a question of bringing all the right people around a table on an information sharing system that can do analytics, that can create case files. And that's what we're aiming to do.
Brilliant. Thanks, Richard. John, you're back with us. We lost you towards the end. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
No, that's okay. I apologize. It's been very frustrating on my end too, but thank you all for listening in, and everybody keep up the great work. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Lena. Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Richard. Thank you, John. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday evening there in the States. To everybody else on this call, have a good working week and all keep safe. And I think this has been a great discussion. I've learned so much in it today. And I hope we can continue more such discussions and work collaboratively together to tackle this key issue. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great week.